Okay, thank you. Thank you, Oscar. Thanks for the invitation. So I'll be talking about gender differences in the labor market effects of COVID-19. And like Oscar mentioned, this is joint work with Kristina. We only have data on Finland, so unfortunately we'll be concentrating only on the effects in Finland. I have a couple of slides on the other Nordic countries using labor force survey data. So if we have time at the end, we might have a look at those. Okay, so we know that the COVID-19 pandemic and the recession it caused differs from most previous recessions in that the service sector was hit especially hard, whereas in previous recession, the service sector has often been quite resilient. And now due to this difference in the way the pandemic impacted different sectors, and due to sort of different occupational structure and female share in different occupations and industries, the employment of women was far more affected than that of men. Then also, as we heard in Caroline's presentation, in many cases, educational responsibility was shifted home to parents. Also, childcare for children who don't go to school yet was shifted home. And some previous evidence shows that this has had a large impact on workers. However, most of the evidence so far is based on survey data, because this is obviously still a very recent event. But as we heard for the Danish case, governments have made use of all sorts of new data sources. And in Finland, the Helsinki Graduate School of Economics has put together a so-called situation room together with the Statistics Finland, where they've made use of data sources that have previously either been available for research with a very long lag, or sort of a lag that is too long for this type of analysis, or then hasn't been available before at all. And so we're going to be using, in our work, we're going to be using this type of data that was sourced by the Situation Room. And we're going to be looking at gender differences in employment effects, and then also how the employment effects spell out into earnings after potentially losing your job or being furloughed. Okay, so first we're going to look at how employment for men and women evolved in Finland during the pandemic. We know from work on surveys in other countries that women and lower educated workers were most negatively affected. We also know that there have been quite large differences in the employment effects in different countries. So in the US and UK, employment was affected much more than in, for example, Germany. We're also going to be looking at how large the earnings losses due to being either temporarily or fully laid off have been during the pandemic. So this is contributing to the literature on job displacement, which is obviously very large. I've only listed a couple of the most recent and sort of relevant references here. We know that earnings losses after displacement are particularly large in recessions. We also know from very recent work that women suffer larger earnings losses after mass layoffs than men. So we'll be looking at how the earnings of people who were laid off either temporarily or then sort of who had to register as fully unemployed, how their earnings evolved. Then obviously, since this has had a very different effect on different sectors, we're going to look at how the impact differed by industry. And also due to this situation with schools closed and daycares closed and so on, we're going to be looking at whether there's a different effect by for people who have children compared to those who don't. And as I mentioned, we're going to be using this high frequency register data. So this data that was collected, especially for analysis of labor markets during this pandemic. And we're going to be using data that is basically daily, so we can follow these workers almost real time. Okay, as we've already heard today, there have been numerous restrictions that have been enforced during the pandemic. Also, we've heard about policies that governments have put in place to try to counteract the pandemic and help people who have become unemployed, policies that have been targeted at firms to help them survive the restrictions and so on. And then obviously, different countries at different stages have put in place programs for vaccinations. In Finland, all of these were implemented. Looking at the timeline, here we've plotted the cases weekly that have been registered. And obviously there's this issue of how testing evolved. In the beginning, there wasn't that much testing. But as we can see, the first restrictions to be put in place were in March, when schools closed, and gatherings of more than 10 people were prohibited completely. In conjunction with the school closure, also daycare facilities, they didn't close, but there was a recommendation that you shouldn't put your child in daycare if you don't have to, and this led to a very dramatic drop in people who in children who were attending daycare. Related to the labor market effects, actually the first through third graders were also not permitted to go to in-person school unless their parents were in occupations that were considered essential. So, some occupations related to food supply and so on. Okay, then also beginning of April, restaurants were closed and the region around Helsinki was isolated from the rest of the country to try and prohibit the spread of the disease. Then, after these initial restrictions, we quite soon the travel throughout the country was allowed again. That was very controversial to have it closed. Schools were opened in May, and restaurants were open with some restrictions, and gatherings of more than 10 but less than 50 people were allowed at the beginning of the summer. Going forward, when cases started to rise at the end of last year, there were local restrictions put in place that tried to take into account, as was discussed before, the sort of the spread of the disease and how the cases were developing in different parts of the country. Vaccination started at the end of last year, but only actually properly got underway during the spring. And then with the Delta virus, the new rise in cases. And as of October, gatherings have been allowed, but there are still these restaurant restrictions based on the situation in different areas. So basically the big picture is that the main restrictions happened here at the very beginning. These were nationwide, and then there have been local restrictions after that. And this is going to be, when we look at employment, this is going to be the most significant when we look at when sort of certain sectors are very much impacted by the closing of restaurants and so on. Okay, then the government did various things to try and help workers and firms. Finland has a furlough system where an employer can temporarily lay off an employee, but the employment contract is still valid, and then the worker receives unemployment benefits. I think there's a pretty much similar system in Norway, and it's different from Denmark, where this wage compensation scheme was put in place. This has proven to be very important for flexibility in the pandemic. The bulk of the employment change has been gone through furloughs. The furlough system was also made more lenient. There were changes to unemployment insurance to make it easier to qualify. there were changes to bankruptcy law and tax relief and certain subsidies for firms to try and help them get over the pandemic. And these will all sort of obviously have an impact on employment, but we can't really put a finger on what that effect is. Okay, so the data we use, we're going to be using the incomes register, which is basically daily payment data on earnings that are taxable in Finland. So all earnings will be included. It's only available from 2019 onwards. And it's available with a lag of about 45 days. It's daily in the sense that we observe the day of every payment made to workers, but obviously no one is paid every day. But there's information on the start and end dates of the payment spells, so we can use that. Then we also use the public employment service data on registrations as unemployed or furloughed. And we have very current data thanks to the Situation Room. Usually we have it with a lag. And then we combine this to Statistics Finland register data on workers and firms. We obviously have employer and employee identifiers in all of these data sets. Okay, so how did employment develop? We've plotted here employment as defined as a person earning at least 1,000 euros per month, or the equivalent of 1,000 euros per month. And we've got calendar months on the x-axis here, and then thousands of employees here. And now, as you can see, at the beginning of sort of the pandemic, there was a huge drop in employment, both for men in black here and for women in red. The relative drop was actually slightly higher for women, about more than 8%, and it was about 6% for men year over year. There was some recovery quite quickly, and now I'm afraid the 2021 doesn't show very well, but sort of a lot of the losses in employment were already recovered coming into 2021. Now, as we already talked about, there were huge differences of the fear of the pandemic and so on. Here, this is the most affected industry, which is hotels and restaurants. And we can see that it's an industry with a high female share, so over 60% women in the industry. And the employment drops at the start of the pandemic are over 50%. So this is a very big impact on employment here. The recovery starts, but different to the sort of overall employment, it's a bit slower than for the employment in aggregate. And you can see that here, still in beginning of this year, employment is lagging the levels of 2019. And now, at this point, now this is only till August, but at this point, there are already difficulties recruiting. So I think, as was mentioned for Denmark, there are difficulties in finding workers. And in Finland, at least, the discussion has been that there could be sort of people who've been unemployed or furloughed from these industries that were very much affected, that they've taken on other employment, especially in sectors where you have part-time work like this. Students have gone into full-time study and not necessarily coming back so quickly and so on. This is the most affected sector. Now, there are similar but not as big developments in other sectors. Within sectors, for example, in logistics and trade, women were slightly more affected. That's probably, we're looking at very broad sectors. So that these can be due to occupational structure, sort of occupation differences within the sectors. But generally, what's interesting is obviously women were affected in the same way as men, but the female share is obviously much higher in these sectors that were badly affected. Okay, so then a huge employment drop. How did this affect the earnings of these employees? So here we're comparing the average earnings for employees who were either furloughed or became unemployed, and employees who did not experience unemployment or furlough. And we only use the first incidence of unemployment or furlough. So here at time 0, these people have registered as unemployed or furloughed at the Public Employment Service. And we can see that there's a difference in the earnings levels before also, but there's a big drop here at the time. And it doesn't, we're following them for 6 months after the first incidence of unemployment or furlough, and the earnings don't fully recover during that time. Then looking at this a bit more rigorously in a regression framework to look at what happened. Here we've plotted point estimates of the effect of unemployment or furlough on earnings. So it's 5 months before and 6 months after the incidence. And we can see that the magnitudes are big for both men and women. They are sort of relatively, they're the same relative effect. And for both men and women, earnings don't fully recover during our 6-month follow-up period. Then, as discussed, we know that there could be effects from school closures, daycare closures, and so on how people can participate in the labor market. Or, for example, when they are unemployed or furloughed, will they be actively searching for work? So what we've done here is we've plotted the estimates. This is from a nested regression, so these are from the same regression. The estimates of the effect on earnings, or the impact of what happens to your earnings once you become unemployed or furloughed, for men and women who have children and men and women who don't have children. And it looks very similar. So it doesn't look like, at least in this case of sort of becoming unemployed or furloughed, it doesn't look like the family status has a big effect. Effects for different industries. The most affected industries, the impact of being unemployed or furloughed was huge in if you worked in the hotel and restaurant industry, for both men and women, 65 and 72%. Also logistics, so transportation and so on, big losses for both men and women. And compared to, if you compare the recovery, hotels and restaurants, quite a quick recovery, but in logistics, it's taking quite some time. Okay, so to summarize, we saw that in Finland, employment dropped significantly after the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now the aggregate effect has pretty much recovered since then, but the effect was very different in different industries. And in these sectors with a high female share, employment dropped about 50% year on year. The monthly earnings losses after unemployment or furlough were quite similar for men and women in the most affected industries. And we don't see an effect of, or a differential effect for people who have children and don't in these earnings losses that follow unemployment or furlough. We still have a very short follow-up period. We can soon make that longer. But during this period, we don't see earnings recovering fully from unemployment or furlough, which is pretty interesting in that we know that the furlough spells aren't usually, they're not usually very long. So there's the earnings effect is remarkable compared to that. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Hanna. The first discussant would be Helena Svaleryd from Uppsala University, who is here in the room. Please, 15 minutes.
So okay, yeah, thank you very much for letting me comment this paper. I like this a lot. It uses register data in a novel, so there's some new results. And I think it's a very interesting question, a very important question now when the pandemic maybe is almost over. Then it's important to know how what has happened on the labor market and how should we be able to put in the right measures now to get back into maybe an economy that works as it did before or better. So as we just heard, there is evidence from several countries using not registered data, but maybe surveys and such, that the pandemic have had large consequences for women. And that is not what we usually see. Usually see in the economic recessions, the consequences are usually bigger for men. They have a more pro-cyclical employment. But in this recession, which is more pandemic induced and not by economic factors, so several studies have shown that there have been large effects on women, and that is because, as we have heard, kind of maybe repeating some of the things you just heard, that to reduce transmission, we had to reduce activity in sectors where there are more female employees, like hotels, restaurants, and such. And they can be have occupations that are less. That you cannot do remotely, maybe like teaching, for example, or teaching the smaller children, or they can. And then there is this other factor that if women take more responsibility for the children, then if you close schools, this may put a burden on women to a higher extent than men. And if they lose their job, they may not be able to look for a job to the same extent. So it is interesting to look at how it affects men and women and why. And now the results Hanna was going through. So what I read was that that there's a larger drop of employment in female-dominated industries as one big conclusion. But the effect, if you lose a job, the effect is about the same for both men and women. And they don't recover totally. In this 6-month period, we see some recovery, but not to initial levels. So my comments will be on some on the interpretation of the results and some more wishes, which you can possibly do with the data. and also some things I think could be added to the article. So are women more affected? So when I looked at this, the first table is a description of the sample. So it's a sample with employees that do not lose their job, and there's a sample of employees that do lose their job. And if you look at these two samples, it seems like the share of women is higher in the sample which do not lose their jobs. So it seems that if you just look at this aggregate data, it seems like men are more hit. Or, I mean, the difference is so little here that it's maybe no difference. So I think there are sectors that are less hit by the pandemic, where job losses may be less than usual. So for example, health, social work, the education sector. So those type of sectors are also very female oriented. There's a lot of female occupied working in these sectors. So I think it could be nice to, because now when you read it, it feels like women are more hit, but I'm not sure that that's the case in Finland, although it may be the case in the UK and some of these other countries. It may not be in the aggregate the same in Finland. So it seems to be a larger short-term, like the drop at the beginning, so the first circle over there, it's a larger drop for women than for men. But at the end of the period, the more round circle, you see like the difference between the pre-pandemic level for men is larger than it is for women, if you compare the different curves there. So I was just wondering if there's a short-term effects, maybe hit women more, but are the long-term effects larger for men? So that kind of comes back to who is actually hit the most by this shock. So my first wish then is to maybe, since you have data for a much longer time period, and the largest hit or the drop in employment was actually quite early on, it would be very good to look at a longer follow-up period. And if you look at that, when does employment starts to recover, that is within 9 months or something. So 6 months is a little bit early. So when you see the aggregate numbers going back to normal levels, it would be nice to see if it's, because it could still be that the people that have actually lost a job, they're not getting back. Maybe there's other people coming in. So it's not, it could still be, but it would be nice to kind of disentangle those effects. So I think it's in this particular case, especially interesting to look at maybe a year or 9 months. And maybe also look at, okay, you have the ones that lost a job in the beginning or the ones that lose jobs later. It could also be interesting. So they had a really nice graph. I think I hope that will be added in the final version when you had all the disease containment measures and the timeline. I thought that was very nice. Right now it's like in the text, but now you get to visualize. It's very easy to see. But what I missed is a description of what happens, what kind of measures are taken to mitigate the effects on the labor market. And are there such? We heard in the first presentation this morning, we heard that different countries in the Nordic countries have different policies to mitigate the effects on the labor markets and for individuals. And it would be nice to have some of that discussion too, to understand the effects. So by now there are several studies from different countries trying to look at the consequences on the labor market in the aggregate, and maybe also some different groups and men and women. But I think it would be nice to have some kind of discussion, and not that you're going to do this analysis on all the Nordic countries, but it would be nice to maybe relate a little bit to what are the differences in the way these disease containment measures have been affecting the different sectors, and how do we see it along. I mean, the first presentation we heard this morning, we'll look at it on the aggregate, but maybe you can at least address this. Because I think, for example, in the service sector in Sweden, in the hotel and restaurants, it's not so unequal when it comes to gender. There is more equal, but both men and women work there to the same extent. So a shock to that sector would perhaps not have the same consequences. The different consequences for men and women. So this is like a wish, and it could be, of course, a huge thing to take on, but it would be nice to have some type of discussion when you relate the actual effects you find to the situation that actually Finland has. And just to, as a last slide, I just, this is just from the web, from the public unemployment services in Sweden, where they have monthly data on unemployment. And this is both people in the programs and open unemployed. So, and I have put in this black line that's like in start of the pandemic. And as you see, it seems like there is, well, I don't know what you say, maybe there is not much difference between men and women in Sweden. There's a little bit of an increase among men at middle, and then, but at the end it seems to go down, and yeah, I don't know if this will be statistically significant. So maybe there are very interesting differences, and my reading of your result is maybe that on the aggregate, the effects on men and women are not that different, whereas we know in the Anglo-Saxon countries, there seems to be a much bigger difference. Okay, so that was my comments.
Okay, thanks, Helena. Now everyone starts to know the drill. We're moving to the next set of comments. That will be from Birte Larsen at Copenhagen Business School. And she's joining us via Zoom. But the floor is yours, and you have 15 minutes, please.
I just was given the permission to share my slides, so I'm sorry, that's just going to take a couple of seconds. Okay, so please tell me if this doesn't work, or if you can't hear me, or if you can't see the slides. So, okay, so yeah, my name is Birte Larsen, and I'm an associate professor at CBS, and I'm super happy to be asked to comment on this paper on labor market outcomes by gender in Finland. So first I'm going to say briefly what this paper is about. I know we just had it, but just to have an idea about what it's about, also to have an idea about how we can compare to other Nordic countries, for example, and then I have some comments related to that. So this paper is about what happened to gender inequality during the pandemic in Finland, where administered data is used. And the authors consider the impact of employment and income for men and women, and they look at different sectors. And let me first say, I think this is a super interesting and very, very important question, because it's something which has heavily been discussed in the whole world during the pandemic. And I think it is an issue, of course, we should discuss. So here, the next couple of slides will be both some questions and some comments, and it's all like a little bit mixed because it was what I came to think about when I read this paper. And so it's the first question is related to this balloting schemes, which Hannah actually already mentioned when she talked, and where there are huge differences between countries. And I think that is one thing which needs, it would be very interesting to have that discussed in the paper. It was very unclear to me when I read the paper what is really the difference between the different countries, or how is it exactly in Finland. So how did it work? And now Hannah was presenting, I understood that the workers being furloughed, they receive unemployment insurance, and so they didn't receive a salary. And that is, of course, very different, or that is going to have a huge impact on what happens to income. So in Denmark, what happened was that you have to send a worker home with full pay, and then you would be subsidized 25% by the 75% by the government, but you as a firm would have to pay the 25% of the worker's salary yourself. But then there was a max, so that could have an implication of which kind of workers would be sent home, because for some firms, actually it was then more than the 25% they had to pay themselves, because there was this max subsidy they could receive by the government. So I think that is one important issue, and it would have been nice for me to have this understanding, because I think that is something which is quite important for who are really sent home and who are not, and therefore, and actually perhaps you could answer that, Hannah, but actually, so why are Finnish firms not always furloughing then? Is it, I'm just thinking that, so that it could be, then you just always have the possibility to take back the worker and you don't have to pay them anything. So that is just something which is unclear to me, why you then choose to really fire workers. Okay, so, but perhaps it's because you have a less flexible labor market than in Denmark. In many jobs in Denmark, you can just fire workers and you just hardly have to give them salary for more than, for a short period. It might be only like a month or less for some workers. So the other thing which I think is important is which sector we're looking at here. We're looking only at the private sector, I guess, and I guess more women than men are working in public sector like health, and they may therefore have been better off and therefore been much less exposed to the risk of being fired than a lot of these workers working in the private sector. So if we look at all women as a whole, then it might be that women in general have not been more negatively affected than men. There's actually a paper by a Danish master student at Aarhus University, who did also look at the difference between men and women, and I can send you the reference later on to that paper, but where she doesn't really find huge differences between men and women when you look at the change in income during the pandemic. And a final thing on this slide is that it's, of course, which has already been mentioned by Helena, it's important what happens in the long run, but we already know a bit about that. If women are more affected, it might be having a long run impact on promotions. I know some of my colleagues here, I know particularly some of the women that have had some issues about how to work at the same time as having small kids at home. So one fortunate thing in many Scandinavian countries, I think, at least in Denmark, is that schools were open for almost all the time. They were only closed for very short periods, and the daycare centers were open almost all the time. And that is, of course, very important if you want to work at the same time. But for those, during those periods where you have had the schools closed, and also some of the people having kids in private schools, they have some issues with the after school programs. And so the schools here in Denmark, they close very early. So they close like at at 12 or 1 o'clock for the small kids. And so if there's an issue with the after-school program, then it might be important for women. They might be able to work some, but for some women actually not able to work full-time, and therefore it might have some long-run impact on promotions. And I know it's very difficult to know right now, but it might be something which it's important to look in the longer horizon, and there might be already some indication through surveys or something like that. And I think it's a super cool, interesting result you have with respect to that that women with and without kids, they are not differently affected, because that really, the comments I just had about, well, you could imagine that women would be more negatively affected if there was some social norm about that they had to take more care of the kids if they were at home. But it seems like you don't get this result. But again, what I'm thinking about here is then also related to the longer horizon. It might be the case that if we look in a few months or years, then that you have perhaps not had so much time to work is important for the promotions you might then not be able to get as you would have been if there had not been a pandemic. And then a final comment I have is related to something, again, a longer horizon comment. That is, it's interesting whether working from home is going to be more common. It's something definitely a lot of people have been discussing here in Denmark, and some people might think, oh, it's actually, there's something nice about it, it gives me more flexibility. And of course, it might be nice with more flexibility. You can work from home. If it's one of the days where you have to send kids to daycare school and you have to pick them up again. But it might also have the impact then that you then, as a woman, might be the one who then take the kids to the dentist, doctor, after school activities. If you're home already, you're the one who will pick them up if they're called home because they're sick or something like that. So that is definitely something which might have an impact in the long horizon, and perhaps you know something about predicted changes in that direction from Finland. There might be again some surveys or something, or that firms that firms already have allowed some people to work from home or not, and which firms we have been talking, which firms might have already talking about that. So for a lot of firms here, they sent home some extra computers or tables. So in Denmark, by law, if you work in the public sector, then you need one of those, or you actually have the possibility to get one of these tables where you can move them up and down. And if you already spent some money on that, then you might think that is important to have. Why not give more workers the possibility to work from home? So I think that was about the comments I had. I have a couple of references I can send to you if you're interested, but that were the comments I wanted to give right now. So thank you very much.
Okay, so thanks a lot. Maybe you can stop sharing the slides. Very insightful comments again. I think we'll do as last time, so we'll let Hannah respond to the comments by the two official commentators, and then we open the floor for other questions.
Okay, thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks a lot to both for the very good comments. Yes, first of all, to the observation that the overall drop in employment was quite short-lived for women and maybe not that different from men. And then looking at the actual sort of share unemployed and furloughed, that's a very good observation, and we've actually we talked about that earlier. That there are obviously these sectors which are female-dominant sectors and which have actually done very well in the pandemic. So the healthcare sector in particular, and what makes it even more sort of an important comment, and something we should definitely include in the paper, is that that's a big sector. So looking at hotels and restaurants or the recreation sector, they're small, so in terms of numbers of employees. So when you counteract that with like a sector like the healthcare sector that's doing very well, then that will affect it. Another thing that can also have an effect is that, like I mentioned in the case of the hotels and restaurants, that some of these will have been students who are working part-time, and so they're not employed in our category when we look at how much they earn, but they don't necessarily register as furloughed or unemployed. They just go back to their studies, which is their main activity anyway. So, but that's a very, very good point, and we definitely need to look into that. And it's related to what Birte also said on the about whether this is just the private sector. This is the whole all sectors, whole population, everyone. So we definitely should include some analysis on that. And also the point on how the sort of dynamics go. So the largest drop was in the beginning, and then men still haven't recovered, and women quickly. So we'll need to look at that. Also, the longer follow-up period. That's definitely a good point. That's something that we are sort of also already in the process of doing. We initially included the sort of as long a period as possible for when you can be unemployed or furloughed. But like you mentioned, it's the brunt is in the beginning, and we could look at that and then follow them for a longer time. So that's a very good point also. Let's see. Oh yes, then to do with the sort of the Nordic comparison or different countries trying to relate the disease containment measures, and then maybe different sectors. That's something that we definitely should do. I don't know if I can share. I had a couple. I could maybe show one slide that I have on the Nordic. This is going to be aggregate. So, but I liked your idea of sort of looking at the different sectors and how that has, because there's going to be the aggregate containment measure analysis in the beginning and so on. But yeah. So let's see. Okay. Yeah. Here. So looking at this is labor force survey data in the Nordic countries, and looking at the change in employment rate in, or you can't see, but it's in at the last quarter of 2020 compared to the last quarter of 2019. And the gray bars are the change in employment rate in total, and then there's the change for men in black and the change for women in red. And as you can see, well, Iceland is in total, it's a league of its own. Looking at the differences between men and women, quite small in all countries, even in Finland, which is the largest difference. It's just over a percentage point. So very not huge differences. But also here, I think the sector analysis would be quite interesting. We'll have to see how far the labor force survey data go to look at what goes on, but definitely some differences between the Nordic countries. Then yeah, the policies to mitigate the effect on the labor market. We didn't have them in the draft. I mentioned some of them here now. So the unemployment insurance scheme was made more accessible, and there were certain measures put in place for firms to prevent bankruptcy and so on. And in terms of not a lot going on in terms of ALMP, but the earnings disregard, so how much you can earn before your unemployment benefits are affected, that was raised, and that's still in effect. So that's something that they're trying to use to sort of get people to take on even short-term employment. Let's see what else. Yes, and then the description that Bette was asking for, the description of the furlough scheme. We'll need to explain that in more detail. And actually, it's an important point because in Finland, the furlough scheme will include people who have reduced working hours. So you can be furloughed full-time, or you can be furloughed, for example, 2 days a week. So it's definitely something we need to consider and discuss in the paper. Yes, and then the longer run effects of working from home and so on. That's definitely something we need to consider. I don't know if there's been discussion in Finland of the potential effects of that, but we'll need to look at the literature from elsewhere and then also look at what's been discussed in Finland. I don't know if Kristina has any insights on that yet. No, yeah. Yes, but thanks both for very, very good comments. We'll definitely move the paper in that direction. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, no, it is. Yeah, it is. To some extent, I looked at sort of foreign background workers and sort of workers with Finnish background earlier, and to some extent they've been more affected because they work in a lot of these service sectors. So the workers with a foreign background. In terms of like the official statistics, it's hard to look at them in the official statistics because not all workers with foreign background will register as unemployed or furloughed, because they may not realize they have the right to unemployment benefits, or they may still not have the right to unemployment benefits. So it's a bit harder to follow them. But in general, yes, they have been affected more to the extent that they work in these sectors that have been affected more. And obviously things like the support services may not be as familiar to them. Although here as well, coming back to Helena's point on the healthcare sector, there is a very large share of women with foreign background working in the Finnish healthcare sector. So that sort of then again counteracts the aggregate effect, but obviously there will be these sectoral differences. But yeah, that's a point we could look at that in the analysis.
Hi.
Oh, sorry.
I was thinking, since this is like more general about the impact of COVID and the women, then I think the whole issue of gender equality is something that can be somehow taken up, and things taken up what you, Birthe, was saying as well. It's this thing like what happens with promotion and stuff like that, but there's maybe service discussing about who was at home, who was the one when both parents were at home with the children, who was with the children. Surveys in Scandinavia that talk about something like that. The other thing is that I come from Norway, so I'm not really sure what's happening so much in other countries, but at least I see a lot of women with trolleys. So how is this related to a lot of, you know, in this period, just having children, and depending on what sort of policies you have in these countries related to this, it can affect them differently. And the third thing is that if it is the case that we're going to go much more to home office, is there any gender differences here? Do we expect more women to stay more at home and do like stay at home to pick up children, to stay with children that are a bit sick but not very sick, and all this might affect this sort of gender thing differently, more than how much they work or not work just now, but that there's this gender dimension into the COVID thing. So I don't really know what you're supposed to do, but there are things when you think of gender that I think, where are we going, and long-term impacts of COVID on this gender issue.
And that's a very good point. And looking at the sort of broader impact and going forward, that's definitely something that should be done. And it was discussed to some extent in these papers using the survey data, Adams, Prussell, and others, and then also on the US data. Yeah, that's definitely something that should be included, since it's a big impact. I'm not sure how much we can sort of, well, we can look at what surveys we can find, but at least we should discuss what's already known, and we'll maybe speculate a bit on how this would be going forward. I'm sure Kristina looked like she wanted to say something.
It's a good point, and I'm sure that there's plenty of mechanism through which the gender differences in the labor market are affected during the COVID period. I think we do need to, however, restrict the analysis. What we can do with the data, it's a bit it's will be more on the labor market, like aggregate impacts. But I think that it's a good point. We will definitely at least include on the discussions. What are the mechanisms that we might see, and which most likely will be affecting in a longer run as well, especially but the information on the remote work we don't really have in the data and these kind of things, so we can't. It's a limited amount that we can do with the data, but good points.
Yes, I have. There's something that's not clear to me, and that's the workers that were either furloughed or made unemployed were compensated by unemployment benefit. But the question is, were they furloughed or were they unemployed? Were they dismissed for the firm? Because if they were dismissed for the firm, genuinely unemployed, they lost the connection to the firm. So the recovery period, would be more difficult and probably longer than if they were furloughed. That was not clear to me. So
yeah, sorry, I should have made that clear, and we should actually put some numbers on that, or a figure on how the share developed. About 3/4 of those who we classify as having lost their job, they were furloughed. So I tried to mention this when I was talking about the furlough. This was a very big flexibility sort of mechanism that most of the sort of impact was caught through furloughs. Now, we don't know yet how much of that will translate into longer term unemployment. But so far we know that in the spring of 2020, the furlough spells lasted about 2 months or so, but on average during this period, they're only about 3 weeks. So these are quite short spells. So 3/4 of this job loss is definitely people who did not lose their connection to their job. We don't know necessarily yet how long lasting the effects will be if there's repeat furloughs. So we understand incidents in any sort of potential subsequent furlough periods would be then included in the follow-up period. Yeah, but that's a good point. We need to make it more clear in terms of what we're
Could I
actually
ask a question related to that? Hannah? Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, because that was also what I was curious about. So how is it, do you then have to take back the worker do you have to decide when the furlough schemes end? And so, because it was a super new thing in Denmark, and as I said, they were fully paid, the workers, and but there was also some agreement about that you had to take back the workers. And so how did that work? I think that is quite important for what happens to those people afterwards.
Yeah. Sorry, I forgot. Yes. So if you furlough a worker, you basically you have to. There are certain conditions under which you can do it, related to production that's gone down, or economically difficult times, and so on. Or if you know that there's just a short-term sort of drop in demand, and you can furlough a worker for either continuously or for a certain period. But if you furloughed workers, there's restrictions on recruitment. So you can't. I know you were asking about why don't firms always just furlough workers and then take them back when they need them? You need to take the furloughed workers back first, before you can recruit other workers. So there are sort of maybe dynamics there. But yes, there are obviously there are some restrictions as to when it's gone on for a long time. The worker can always decide to take up a new job or so on, and then it makes a difference if the worker has been furloughed or laid off. But we should definitely make that more clear in the text and explain like how the furlough system works. There are obviously there's anecdotal evidence that there is something going on, like you mentioned, in that firms with seasonal employment, they basically just hire the workers for the season, and then they furlough them. They get unemployment benefits, and then they just take them back once the season starts again. So that there's a sort of it's not the idea of the furlough system, but there is evidence that some of that can be going on. Yeah. Thanks. Anything else?